History is not a complete story. Entire chapters were never written. Others were lost, forgotten, or erased. What we know is only a fragment. And what's missing may matter the most. Most of human history was never recorded. Lives were lived, decisions were made, and then forgotten. What remains is not the full story, only what survived. History often feels like a finished book. A long story with a clear beginning, a steady middle, and a known ending. Names are written down, dates are memorized, and events are placed neatly on a timeline, as if nothing important ever fell outside the margins. But this sense of completeness is an illusion. What we call history is not the full record of the past. It is only what survived, what was written, preserved, copied, translated, and passed along through fragile chains of time. Entire generations lived and died without leaving a single sentence behind. Their choices, fears, routines, and discoveries vanished quietly, not because they were unimportant, but because no one recorded them. For most of human existence, writing did not exist at all. People spoke, remembered, and forgot. Knowledge was carried in voices, gestures, and habits, passed from one generation to the next through memory alone. When those chains broke, through migration, disaster, or simple time, the knowledge broke with them. Even after writing appeared, it was rare, expensive, controlled. Only a small fraction of people could read or write, and fewer still decided what was worth recording. Everyday life was usually ignored. Ordinary people rarely appeared in official accounts. History favored kings over farmers, battles over silence, and endings over the long stretches in between. And then there is loss. Libraries burned. Cities collapsed. Archives were abandoned. Scrolls decayed. Stone inscriptions eroded under wind and rain. What remains today is uneven, dense in some places, completely silent in others. We know entire empires through a handful of surviving texts, while centuries pass with barely a trace. There are moments where the historical record simply stops. No explanation. No transition. Just absence. These absences are not accidents at the edges of history. They are central to it. Between major civilizations, there are long stretches where we cannot say with confidence how people lived. Between great discoveries, there are gaps where knowledge seems to stall or disappear. Sometimes a society appears suddenly, already complex and organized, without a clear record of how it reached that point. These are the missing chapters. Not myths. Not legends. Not speculation for its own sake. But real, documented gaps, moments where evidence thins, records fail, and certainty fades. Places where historians must admit, quietly and honestly, we do not know. This story is not about rewriting history. It is about listening to what history does not say. In the silence between events. In the years skipped over by timelines. In the people who lived full lives and left nothing behind. Because sometimes, what is missing tells us as much as what remains. Long before the first symbols were carved into stone or pressed into clay, human history existed entirely without written words. For tens of thousands of years, people lived, learned, adapted, and disappeared without leaving behind a single sentence. This period, longer than all recorded history combined, is often reduced to a brief introduction, as if it were merely a prelude rather than a defining chapter. In this world without writing, knowledge survived only as long as memory allowed. Stories were spoken, not stored. Skills were shown, not explained. Everything important, how to hunt, where to find water, which plants healed and which killed, depended on people remembering and passing it on correctly. There were no archives to consult, no texts to return to, no permanent record to protect ideas from being altered or forgotten. Every generation inherited a fragile version of the past. And every generation risked losing it. When a group migrated, when elders died, when famine or conflict scattered communities, entire bodies of knowledge vanished with them. Nothing marked the loss. No blank pages remained to signal what was gone. The silence simply continued. This absence shapes how little we know about early human societies. We can see tools, shelters, and traces of fire. We can measure bones and analyze residues. But we cannot hear their voices. We cannot know how they explained the world to themselves, how they understood life, death, or time. We are left to infer meaning from fragments, objects separated from the thoughts that once gave them purpose. Even when early symbolic systems began to appear, they were limited. Marks scratched into stone or painted onto cave walls did not function like language as we know it. They hinted rather than explained. They survived, but their full meanings did not. What remains is impression, not clarity. Writing did not emerge everywhere at once. It appeared slowly, unevenly, and for specific purposes, often economic or administrative. The earliest written records are lists, counts, inventories. They tell us what was owned, not how people felt. What mattered enough to preserve was not daily life, but control, trade, and organization. And so, the silence persisted. For most people, for most of history, life unfolded without documentation. Births, deaths, relationships, rituals, fears, all of it vanished the moment memory failed. What we know today represents only a thin surface layer, shaped by chance survival rather than deliberate preservation. This long silence is not empty. It is simply unreachable. And it forms the largest missing chapter of all. When historians arrange the past into timelines, certain civilizations seem to appear almost without warning. One moment, there is silence, scattered settlements, simple tools, limited organization. Then suddenly, there are cities. Roads. Laws. Writing systems. Architecture precise enough to survive thousands of years. It feels abrupt, as if entire societies emerged fully formed. This impression is misleading, but it reveals a deeper problem. Civilizations do not rise overnight. They require generations of experimentation, failure, adaptation, and accumulation of knowledge. Agriculture must stabilize. Social roles must solidify. Belief systems must form. Techniques must be refined slowly, often invisibly. And yet, for many ancient societies, we cannot trace this gradual development clearly. Take early urban centers. In the archaeological record, they often appear already complex. We find organized streets, monumental buildings, advanced craftsmanship, and administrative systems, but little evidence showing how these elements evolved step by step. The earliest layers we uncover are not beginnings. They are already outcomes. This creates a gap between cause and result. We know these civilizations did not simply materialize. People lived there before the cities. They learned to cooperate, to plan, to store resources, to govern themselves. But much of that process unfolded without durable records. Organic materials decayed. Temporary structures vanished. Knowledge passed through practice rather than preservation. What survives is biased toward permanence. Stone remains. Clay hardens. Metal endures. But wood rots. Textiles disintegrate. Voices fade. As a result, the slow human processes that turn communities into civilizations are often missing from the record. We see the finished structure, not the scaffolding that once held it up. This makes history appear sharper and more sudden than it truly was. In some cases, the problem is compounded by destruction. Cities were built on top of older cities. Fires, floods, and rebuilding erased earlier layers. What came before was literally buried beneath what followed. Each generation overwrote the last, leaving archaeologists to reconstruct stories from fragments stacked unevenly across time. This is why certain civilizations feel mysterious. Not because they were unnatural or inexplicable, but because the evidence of their becoming has not survived. Their origins are obscured not by secrecy, but by loss. The danger lies in misunderstanding these gaps. When the gradual disappears, the sudden invites speculation. People imagine missing technologies, forgotten knowledge, or extraordinary interventions. But the truth is often quieter, and more human. These civilizations are not sudden miracles. They are slow stories told without their opening chapters. And once those chapters are gone, they cannot be fully recovered. History is often described as a steady line of progress, knowledge building upon knowledge, generation after generation. But when we look closely, that line is fractured. Ideas emerge, spread, disappear, and sometimes return centuries later as if they were new discoveries. This pattern challenges the assumption that human understanding moves only forward. In many ancient societies, knowledge was deeply local. Techniques, medical practices, engineering solutions, and agricultural methods were often adapted to specific environments and passed down through direct experience. When those societies collapsed or dispersed, their knowledge did not travel far. Without writing or widespread education, information stayed where people stayed, and vanished when they did. There are moments in history when skills once mastered seem to be forgotten entirely. Complex construction techniques fall out of use. Medical understanding regresses. Navigation methods disappear. Later civilizations encounter the remnants of earlier achievements and struggle to explain how they were created. The evidence survives, but the instructions do not. This disappearance does not require catastrophe. Sometimes it happens quietly. Trade routes shift. Political systems change. Institutions dissolve. When the structures that support learning weaken, knowledge becomes fragile. What was once common practice turns into rare expertise. What was once taught becomes inaccessible. Centuries later, the same ideas may resurface, rediscovered rather than remembered. New generations experiment, observe, and slowly arrive at conclusions their predecessors once held. To them, it feels like innovation. To history, it is repetition. This cycle reveals something important about missing chapters. Knowledge does not vanish because it is false or useless. It vanishes because it is not protected. Without systems to preserve and transmit understanding, even the most practical ideas are vulnerable to time. Written records help, but they are not enough. Languages change. Scripts fall out of use. Context is lost. A written instruction without its cultural framework can become meaningless. Symbols survive while meaning dissolves. This is why history contains echoes, familiar solutions appearing in unfamiliar places, separated by centuries. It is not proof of hidden civilizations or forbidden wisdom. It is evidence of how easily human progress can be interrupted. What disappears is not intelligence. It is continuity. And where continuity breaks, history grows quiet again. Once writing finally entered human life, it did not solve the problem of memory. It merely changed its form. Early records were fragile, limited, and often temporary. They were not created to preserve history as we understand it today, but to serve immediate needs, accounting, ownership, authority, control. Clay tablets cracked. Papyrus decayed. Ink faded. Most early writing was never meant to last centuries. It was practical, not archival. A record served its purpose and then lost its value. When environments changed, when administrations collapsed, or when materials wore out, the written word vanished almost as easily as spoken memory. Even when texts survived physically, they did not always survive culturally. Languages evolved. Scripts fell out of use. Symbols that once carried precise meaning became unreadable to later generations. A preserved text without a reader is still a silence. There is also the problem of selection. Writing did not record everything, it recorded what mattered to those in power. Taxes, laws, treaties, inventories. Rarely emotions. Rarely daily routines. Rarely the experiences of ordinary people. What we read today reflects priorities, not reality in full. Entire populations existed only as numbers, if they were recorded at all. And then there is destruction. Sometimes accidental, sometimes deliberate. Libraries burned in fires. Archives were destroyed in wars. Records were erased to rewrite authority. New regimes often removed traces of what came before, not out of mystery, but necessity. Power required a clean beginning. Each loss created a gap, not dramatic, not announced, simply permanent. This is why historical knowledge feels uneven. Some decades are described in exhausting detail, while others pass almost unseen. The imbalance is not intentional. It is the result of survival. What remains shapes our understanding, while what disappears quietly reshapes it even more. The illusion of continuity is built from fragments stitched together across time. Historians do not read history, they reconstruct it. They infer from absence as much as presence. They look for patterns where evidence breaks off and ask why the silence begins there. These silences are not failures of curiosity. They are limits imposed by time. And as fragile as early records were, they still changed everything. They allowed memory to stretch beyond a lifetime. They gave ideas a chance to survive longer than voices ever could. But they did not eliminate forgetting, they only delayed it. The missing chapters did not disappear because humans failed to record them. They disappeared because recording itself was fragile. Much of what we know about the past was written by those who endured it. Survivors recorded victories, justified losses, and explained events from the position they still held. This is not deception, it is circumstance. When societies collapse, when conflicts end, when disasters pass, the voices that remain become the record. Those who did not survive rarely leave testimony. As a result, history often reflects perspective more than completeness. What was written down depended on who still had the means to write, the authority to preserve, and the audience to listen. Entire communities vanished without documentation, not because they lacked stories, but because they lacked continuity. This creates a subtle distortion. Events are framed around outcomes rather than processes. The moment of survival becomes the starting point of the narrative. What happened before, the choices, pressures, compromises, fades into background noise or disappears entirely. Even peaceful transitions shape the record. When political systems change, new administrations inherit old archives selectively. Some documents are preserved. Others are ignored. Some are repurposed to fit new interpretations. Over time, repetition hardens perspective into fact. The result is not a false history, but a partial one. We read about migrations without hearing the debates that preceded them. We see borders drawn without understanding the negotiations that failed. We know the names of rulers, but not the daily labor that sustained their power. Survivors summarize what they endured, they do not always describe what was lost. This pattern repeats across eras. After collapses, histories grow thinner. After recoveries, they grow confident again. The gaps often correspond to periods of instability, when record-keeping was least possible, precisely when change was most intense. Silence, once again, marks transformation. Understanding this does not weaken historical knowledge. It strengthens it. It reminds us that every source carries context. Every record exists because something else disappeared. The absence of voices is not evidence of insignificance, it is evidence of vulnerability. History is not neutral memory. It is memory that endured. And between endurance and disappearance lies a vast field of untold experience, lives shaped by forces we can no longer trace, decisions made without witnesses, and chapters closed before they could be written. These missing chapters are not hidden behind secrets. They are hidden behind survival. When we look at history on a large scale, it often appears as a sequence of empires, one rising, another falling, followed by the next. Timelines move cleanly from name to name, as if power simply changed hands and the world continued uninterrupted. But between these empires lie long stretches that resist clarity. These are the gaps. Periods where centralized authority weakened, where borders blurred, and where written records thinned dramatically. In these intervals, life did not stop. People continued to farm, trade, migrate, and adapt. Communities reorganized themselves in quieter ways, often beyond the reach of official documentation. Empires were excellent at recording their own existence. They kept archives, inscriptions, laws, and monuments. When they collapsed, those systems collapsed with them. What followed was not necessarily chaos, but decentralization, a return to smaller networks of power and survival. These transitional periods are among the least documented in human history. Not because nothing happened, but because nothing large enough remained to record it systematically. Without administrative centers, writing becomes rare. Without stability, preservation becomes unlikely. Later historians often describe these gaps using broad labels: decline, dark age, transition. Such terms simplify complexity. They suggest absence rather than transformation. But transformation does not always leave clean traces. Trade routes shifted. Skills localized. New identities formed slowly. Some technologies were maintained, others abandoned. Cultural memory fractured into regional traditions rather than shared narratives. The world became quieter, not empty. Archaeological evidence supports this silence. Settlements shrink. Materials become simpler. Monumental architecture pauses. Yet signs of continuity remain: reused structures, adapted tools, evolving burial practices. Change happens without announcement. These gaps challenge our preference for dramatic storytelling. There are no clear beginnings or endings. No declarations of empire, no final battles to mark closure. Instead, there is adjustment, slow, uneven, deeply human. When the next empire eventually rises, it does so atop these quiet centuries. It inherits landscapes shaped by people whose names we will never know. Their contributions are absorbed rather than acknowledged. Their histories dissolve into the foundation of something larger. This is how missing chapters accumulate. Not through disappearance, but through absorption. What lies between empires is not nothing. It is everything that did not fit into power. Timelines give history the appearance of order. Dates align neatly, centuries follow one another, and events seem to unfold in sequence. But this structure is artificial. In reality, timelines are built from what can be dated, not from everything that happened. When records weaken, timelines fracture. There are periods where events cannot be placed precisely. A century becomes a range. A transition stretches across generations. Instead of clear markers, historians rely on approximations, layers of soil, changing styles, incomplete references. Time blurs, not because it slowed, but because measurement failed. This is especially visible in periods of transformation. When political systems collapse, when populations migrate, when cultures merge or fragment, chronology becomes unstable. Different regions experience the same century differently. While one area documents change carefully, another leaves no record at all. As a result, history compresses complexity into simplified sequences. Causes and effects appear closer together than they truly were. Long processes are presented as moments. What actually unfolded over decades is reduced to a single date. This compression creates misunderstandings. It makes change feel sudden. It hides gradual adaptation. It removes the uncertainty people lived through. When timelines break, they reveal something important: historical experience is uneven. Not everyone lived inside the same calendar. Some communities measured time through seasons and memory rather than dates. Others marked time through rulers, disasters, or migrations. These systems rarely aligned with written chronology. Later, when scholars attempted to unify these experiences into a single timeline, they were forced to smooth over inconsistencies. Gaps were filled with estimates. Overlaps were simplified. Silence was converted into neutrality. But silence is not neutral. Where timelines fail, missing chapters emerge. These are not isolated events, but extended stretches where time itself becomes difficult to describe. The story does not stop, it simply resists structure. Understanding this helps explain why history feels uneven. It is not a continuous record moving forward. It is a reconstruction assembled from fragments that survived measurement. And where measurement breaks down, certainty dissolves with it. When history grows quiet, interpretation begins. Gaps in the record invite explanation, and where evidence thins, imagination often steps in. This is not a failure of reason, it is a natural response to uncertainty. Humans are uncomfortable with silence, especially when it appears in places where answers feel necessary. When timelines break and records vanish, questions remain behind. How did people organize themselves? How did they build what remains? How did knowledge pass between generations without leaving clear traces? These questions do not disappear simply because evidence does. Over time, explanations begin to form around absence itself. Some are careful and restrained, grounded in comparison and probability. Others stretch further, shaped by the desire for coherence rather than confirmation. The same gap can support multiple interpretations, depending on what one expects to find. This is how missing chapters become debated chapters. Archaeological remains offer structure but not intention. A tool suggests use, but not instruction. A building reveals skill, but not the process of learning. Without written explanation, interpretation must rely on patterns rather than certainty. This creates space, not for fantasy, but for theory. As centuries pass, theories harden. Repetition gives them weight. What began as a hypothesis can become assumed truth simply because it is repeated often enough. Later discoveries may support, complicate, or contradict these ideas, but rarely replace them entirely. Narratives are resilient. This does not mean history is unreliable. It means it is layered. Facts sit alongside interpretations. Evidence exists beside inference. The challenge lies in knowing where one ends and the other begins. Missing chapters do not invite speculation because they are mysterious. They invite it because they are incomplete. And incompleteness demands explanation, even when certainty is impossible. The danger is not curiosity. The danger is confidence where uncertainty should remain. Understanding how gaps turn into theories helps us read history more carefully. It reminds us to ask not only what is known, but how it came to be known, and what was missing along the way. Theories fill silence, but silence still matters. Not every missing chapter of human history is waiting to be discovered. Some are gone permanently. No excavation, no archive, no future technology will ever restore them. This is not pessimism, it is the reality of time. Many historical losses were absolute. Organic materials decayed completely. Oral traditions ended when communities vanished. Languages disappeared without descendants. In some cases, even the physical traces of existence were erased by erosion, rising seas, or later construction. Nothing remains to analyze, reinterpret, or recover. This finality is difficult to accept. Modern culture is built on the idea that everything can eventually be known, that patience and technology will reveal what is hidden. But history resists this belief. There are moments where evidence does not lie buried, it simply no longer exists. Entire ways of thinking have vanished without record. Belief systems, social rules, explanations of nature, all lived fully within their time and then dissolved. These were not minor footnotes. They shaped lives, decisions, and identities, yet left nothing behind that we can access. What survives often does so by accident rather than importance. A text preserved because it was copied. A structure saved because it was reused. A story remembered because it aligned with later values. Survival does not equal significance. This uneven preservation creates a distorted view of the past. Some cultures appear more influential simply because they left durable traces. Others seem silent not because they lacked complexity, but because their memory was fragile. Understanding this changes how we approach history. The goal is not to complete the story, that is impossible. The goal is to recognize the limits of what can be known and to treat silence with respect rather than suspicion. Missing chapters are not puzzles waiting to be solved. Some are boundaries. And within those boundaries lies humility, the recognition that the past was richer than the record that remains, and that human experience extends far beyond what history can capture. The absence is not a failure of curiosity. It is a reminder of time's power. Once we accept that parts of history are permanently missing, the way we read the past must change. History is no longer a puzzle to be completed, but a landscape to be navigated carefully. It requires restraint, an awareness of what evidence can support and where certainty ends. Reading history responsibly means recognizing absence without rushing to fill it. It means understanding that silence is not an invitation to invent, but a signal to pause. Where records stop, interpretation must slow down rather than expand. This approach does not weaken historical inquiry. It sharpens it. By acknowledging limits, historians become more precise. They separate evidence from assumption, probability from certainty. They resist the temptation to smooth over gaps simply to maintain narrative flow. Modern readers often expect history to function like a story, with clear causes, clear effects, and satisfying conclusions. But the past does not obey narrative structure. It unfolds unevenly. Some moments are overrepresented. Others are barely visible. Accepting this unevenness is part of understanding history as it truly is. This also changes how we evaluate sources. Instead of asking only what a record says, we ask why it exists at all. Who created it? For what purpose? Who was excluded? Every surviving document carries context, intention, and limitation. The most valuable skill in reading history is not memorization. It is discernment. Knowing when evidence supports a claim, and when it does not, protects the past from distortion. It prevents silence from being mistaken for insignificance. It reminds us that millions of lives unfolded beyond the reach of preservation. History, then, becomes a dialogue rather than a declaration. A conversation between what remains and what is missing. Understanding grows not by erasing uncertainty, but by respecting it. The missing chapters do not demand answers. They demand care. And in that care, history regains its depth, not as a complete account, but as an honest one. Missing chapters of history are not confined to the past. They continue to shape how the present understands itself. What we believe about where we came from influences how we define identity, progress, and possibility. When large portions of human experience are absent from the record, our modern assumptions quietly fill the space. These gaps affect more than academic debate. They influence education, cultural narratives, and collective memory. Societies often trace their values and institutions back to selective origins, overlooking the many paths that never entered the historical spotlight. What is remembered becomes normal. What is forgotten becomes invisible. This selective memory can narrow imagination. When history emphasizes only centralized power, monumental achievement, or dominant cultures, it implies that alternative ways of living were marginal or ineffective. In reality, many communities thrived without leaving durable records. Their absence from history does not reflect failure, it reflects fragility of preservation. Understanding missing history also reshapes ideas of progress. If knowledge can disappear, then advancement is not guaranteed. Innovation depends not only on discovery, but on continuity. What is learned must be protected, shared, and adapted, or it risks being lost again. This awareness encourages humility. Modern societies often view themselves as the culmination of a long, inevitable process. Missing chapters challenge that confidence. They remind us that history is contingent, shaped by chance survival as much as intention. There is also empathy in acknowledging what is missing. It recognizes that countless lives mattered deeply to those who lived them, even if no record remains. The past becomes populated not only by famous figures, but by ordinary people whose experiences shaped the world quietly. In this way, missing history still speaks. Not through answers, but through caution. It warns against certainty where evidence is thin. It invites respect for diversity of experience. And it reminds us that what we preserve today will define how future generations understand us. The missing chapters are not empty. They are echoes. And those echoes continue to shape the present. When written history falls silent, archaeology begins to speak. Not loudly, and never completely, but carefully, through fragments, layers, and patterns left behind by people who never intended to be remembered. Archaeology does not recover stories in full. It recovers traces. What remains is rarely dramatic. A foundation where a house once stood. A broken tool discarded after use. A burial that reflects belief rather than explanation. Each find is small on its own, but together they form a quiet language of survival. Archaeologists work without certainty. They do not uncover answers waiting neatly beneath the ground. Instead, they assemble probability. Context matters more than objects. Where something is found often reveals more than what it is. A fragment gains meaning only through its relationship to others. This process is slow. Excavation removes as much as it reveals. Once a layer is uncovered, it cannot be returned. Decisions must be cautious. Interpretation must remain flexible. Every conclusion carries an understanding that future discoveries may alter it. Technology has expanded this pursuit, but it has not eliminated uncertainty. Ground-penetrating radar reveals shapes without substance. Chemical analysis suggests usage, not intention. Dating methods offer ranges, not moments. The deeper archaeology reaches, the more carefully it must move. Despite these limits, archaeology reshapes history. It restores presence where texts never existed. It reveals complexity in societies once dismissed as simple. It uncovers networks of trade, movement, and adaptation that written records ignored. Yet even archaeology cannot reach everything. Many materials decay completely. Entire environments erase traces over time. Rising seas, shifting rivers, and erosion rewrite landscapes continuously. What is found represents only what survived long enough to be found. Chasing what remains is not about completing the story. It is about narrowing the silence. Each discovery reduces uncertainty slightly, while reminding us how much still lies beyond reach. Archaeology does not solve missing chapters. It makes them visible. And in doing so, it transforms absence into presence, not as certainty, but as possibility. Evidence feels solid. It gives history weight, texture, and authority. But evidence does not explain itself. It must be interpreted, placed into context, and connected to other findings. When that context is incomplete, evidence can quietly mislead. A single object can suggest many stories. A burned layer might indicate war, or accident. A mass burial could reflect violence, or disease. Abandoned buildings may signal collapse, or migration. Without written explanation, physical remains are ambiguous. Archaeology reveals what happened far more easily than why. When fragments are isolated, interpretation leans heavily on assumption. The risk is subtle, not fabrication, but oversimplification. History often prefers clean explanations. One cause. One event. One turning point. But real change rarely follows such clarity. It unfolds through overlapping pressures, environmental stress, economic shifts, political instability, social adaptation. Evidence captures pieces of these processes, not their full interaction. This is why interpretations change over time. New findings alter context. What once seemed obvious becomes uncertain. A city thought to be destroyed by invasion may later be understood as abandoned gradually. A culture believed to vanish may instead have transformed quietly into something new. Evidence does not lie, but it does not speak completely. When historians encounter gaps, they must decide how much certainty to claim. Too little, and the story dissolves into indecision. Too much, and speculation hardens into fact. The balance is delicate. The most misleading evidence is not false evidence. It is incomplete evidence presented as final. Understanding this helps explain why historical narratives shift. It is not because the past changes, but because perspective does. Each generation reads the same fragments differently, guided by new methods, new questions, and new awareness of what might be missing. This does not weaken history. It refines it. And it reminds us that every interpretation carries the shadow of uncertainty, especially where chapters are missing. When a city is found empty, the instinct is to search for a single cause. War, invasion, disaster, something dramatic enough to explain absence. But most cities are not abandoned in a moment. They are left behind slowly, through a series of decisions that accumulate until staying no longer makes sense. Cities depend on balance. Water must arrive reliably. Food must move efficiently. Trade must remain connected. Authority must provide enough stability to justify density. When one of these systems weakens, the others compensate. When several weaken at once, the city begins to thin. Environmental change is often the quiet trigger. A river shifts course. Rainfall patterns alter. Soil fertility declines. None of these events announces collapse. They stretch resources, strain planning, and force adaptation. Over time, residents leave not because of fear, but practicality. Economic shifts matter just as much. Trade routes are living systems. When they move, cities anchored to old paths lose relevance. Markets shrink. Crafts decline. Opportunity migrates elsewhere. Population follows. Political pressure accelerates this process. Taxes rise. Authority fragments. Protection becomes uncertain. People respond not with rebellion, but relocation. Families move to villages, to new centers, to places with fewer demands and similar survival prospects. Abandonment rarely looks like failure to those living through it. It feels like adjustment. This is why archaeological layers can mislead. An empty city does not mean a vanished people. It often means redistributed communities. Skills continue elsewhere. Traditions persist in smaller forms. The city dissolves, but life does not. Sometimes abandonment is partial. A city shrinks to its core. Outer districts fade first. Public buildings lose function. Maintenance stops. Eventually, what remains no longer resembles an urban center, but it is still inhabited. Understanding abandonment requires patience. It demands attention to systems rather than events. Cities are ecosystems, not monuments. They grow, adapt, and contract in response to pressure. When we encounter empty streets and fallen walls, we are not seeing an ending. We are seeing a choice made repeatedly, over time. And those choices rarely leave written explanations behind. For a long time, the decline of the Maya cities was described as a mystery, a sudden collapse of a powerful civilization. Empty ceremonial centers, abandoned pyramids, and silent plazas seemed to suggest catastrophe. But the reality, revealed gradually through archaeology and environmental study, is far more complex, and far more human. The Maya world did not fall all at once. It thinned. At their height, Maya cities were deeply interconnected systems. They relied on seasonal rainfall, careful water management, intensive agriculture, and political legitimacy tied to ritual and leadership. These systems worked, until pressure accumulated faster than adaptation could respond. Climate played a critical role. Extended drought strained water storage and crop yields. Reservoirs dropped. Fields produced less. Food insecurity grew slowly, unevenly, and persistently. This was not a single bad year, but repeated stress across generations. Political fragmentation added to the strain. Maya cities were independent centers competing for influence. Warfare increased, not necessarily for conquest, but for legitimacy. Leaders were expected to maintain balance between the human and natural worlds. When they failed, trust eroded. As conditions worsened, people made practical decisions. They moved away from dense urban centers toward smaller settlements with easier access to land and water. The monumental cores, temples, palaces, plazas, lost relevance first. Daily life shifted elsewhere. What remains today reflects this transition. The stone structures endured because they were built to last. The lives that moved on did not. The disappearance appears sudden only because preservation favors architecture over movement. There is no single cause behind the Maya decline. No final disaster. No abrupt ending. Instead, there is a gradual withdrawal from complexity under pressure. A reorganization of life rather than a disappearance of people. This reframes the narrative entirely. The Maya did not vanish. They adapted. Their descendants still live in the region today. What ended was not a culture, but a specific way of organizing it. The missing chapter lies not in destruction, but in transition, a process that left few durable records behind. Cities do not exist in isolation. Even the most powerful urban centers depend on networks that extend far beyond their walls. Trade routes move food, materials, ideas, and people. When those routes weaken or disappear, cities feel the impact long before the cause becomes visible. Trade is not only economic. It is structural. It connects regions with different resources and balances local shortages. A city without stone imports cannot build. A region without metal exchange cannot maintain tools. A port without passing ships loses relevance quickly. When trade routes collapse, the effects are rarely immediate. At first, alternatives are found. Supplies are rationed. Local substitutes are used. But over time, limitations compound. Crafts decline. Markets shrink. Specialized labor becomes unnecessary. Urban life loses its advantage. This process leaves subtle archaeological traces. Imported materials become scarce. Coin circulation drops. Foreign goods vanish from layers of occupation. What once flowed freely becomes rare, then absent. These changes often precede visible abandonment by decades. Trade routes collapse for many reasons. Environmental shifts alter coastlines and river paths. Political instability makes travel unsafe. New routes emerge elsewhere, bypassing old hubs. No single decision causes the change, it is the accumulation of risk. For people living within these systems, collapse feels gradual. There is no announcement. No moment of realization. Life simply becomes more constrained. Opportunities narrow. Movement begins. This is why cities tied tightly to trade are among the most vulnerable. Their strength depends on connection. When connection fades, density becomes a liability rather than an advantage. Archaeology often reveals this story in reverse. Empty cities are discovered first. Only later does analysis reveal the disappearance of external links that once sustained them. The missing chapter lies not in the city itself, but in the invisible lines that once connected it to the world. Trade routes do not leave monuments. But their absence reshapes everything. Not all missing chapters are buried beneath soil. Some lie beneath water, sealed away by rising seas that quietly erased entire landscapes. As the climate shifted at the end of the last ice age, coastlines moved dramatically. What were once fertile plains, settlements, and travel routes were slowly submerged. This process was not sudden. It unfolded over generations. People adapted at first. Shorelines retreated. Camps were relocated. Villages shifted inland. But eventually, entire regions disappeared beneath the sea. No collapse. No disaster. Just gradual loss of habitable land. These submerged landscapes once connected continents. Places that now feel isolated were once part of continuous worlds. Trade, migration, and communication flowed across areas that no longer exist above water. When the sea rose, those connections were severed permanently. One of the most striking examples is Doggerland, a vast landmass that once linked Britain to mainland Europe. It supported human settlement for thousands of years. Forests grew there. Rivers flowed. People hunted, gathered, and lived ordinary lives. Today, it lies beneath the North Sea. Because water preserves differently than land, much of this history left no trace. Wooden structures decayed. Organic materials vanished. Only scattered tools, bones, and sediments hint at what once existed. The story is fragmented beyond reconstruction. Underwater archaeology is limited by access. Visibility is poor. Excavation is difficult. Preservation is unpredictable. What is lost to the sea is often lost entirely, not destroyed, but unreachable. These submerged chapters challenge how we imagine the past. Maps become misleading. Borders feel permanent when they are not. Landscapes we assume eternal were once temporary. The sea did not erase these histories violently. It covered them patiently. And because they lie beyond easy reach, they rarely enter public memory. No ruins rise above water. No monuments remain to invite attention. Entire human worlds exist now only as geological hints and isolated finds. These chapters were not forgotten because they lacked importance. They were forgotten because they slipped below the surface. Not all disasters announce themselves with destruction. Some arrive quietly, altering conditions just enough to make old ways of living unsustainable. Climate shifts have repeatedly shaped human history, not through sudden catastrophe, but through prolonged pressure that left little room for adaptation. Temperature drops by a few degrees. Rain patterns change slightly. Growing seasons shorten. Individually, these changes appear manageable. Collectively, they destabilize entire systems. One of the most powerful examples is sudden cooling caused by volcanic eruptions. When massive eruptions eject ash and sulfur into the atmosphere, sunlight weakens. Temperatures fall. Harvests fail. These effects can last years, even decades. For people dependent on seasonal agriculture, the result is not immediate collapse, but chronic scarcity. Written records rarely describe these events clearly. Crop failure is mentioned without cause. Famine is recorded without explanation. Migration appears without context. The climate itself remains invisible in historical texts, leaving later generations to reconstruct its role through indirect evidence. Ice cores, tree rings, and sediment layers now reveal these silent disasters. They show periods of stress aligning with social disruption. But these tools did not exist for most of history. People experiencing the change could not see the pattern, only the consequences. Climate pressure amplifies existing weaknesses. Trade routes already strained become unreliable. Political legitimacy falters when leaders cannot protect food supply. Communities fracture as resources thin. No single decision causes collapse, but every decision becomes harder. These disasters leave subtle traces. Settlements shrink. Nutrition declines. Burials increase. Materials become simpler. These signs are easy to misread as cultural decline rather than environmental response. The most dangerous aspect of silent climate disasters is how easily they vanish from memory. Without dramatic destruction, they leave no monuments. Without clear records, they fade into background noise. Yet their impact is profound. They reshape populations, accelerate migration, and redraw cultural boundaries. Entire chapters of human history unfold under these pressures, leaving behind consequences without explanation. Climate did not destroy civilizations. It changed the rules they lived by. And many of those changes were never recorded, only endured. Slow collapse does not feel like collapse to those living through it. There is no clear moment when people realize that a system is failing. Life continues in smaller adjustments, reduced expectations, altered routines, quieter hopes. What historians later call decline often felt like endurance. When conditions worsen gradually, communities respond pragmatically. Diets change first. Foods once common become occasional. Trade goods are replaced with local alternatives. Crafts simplify. None of these changes signal disaster. They signal adaptation. As pressure continues, social structures adjust. Extended families combine households. Authority decentralizes. Responsibilities shift downward, away from centralized control. The world becomes more local, more immediate. Survival replaces expansion as the primary goal. These adaptations leave traces, but they are subtle. Archaeology records fewer imported goods, simpler tools, smaller buildings. Without context, these signs are easy to misinterpret as cultural loss. In reality, they reflect strategic choice, a narrowing of focus to what can be sustained. People living through slow collapse rarely see themselves as part of a larger historical process. They experience change in personal terms, fewer options, harder seasons, longer distances to opportunity. Decisions are made for families, not civilizations. This is why written records often fail to describe collapse clearly. Chronic stress does not inspire documentation. Survival leaves little time for reflection. When writing exists, it records outcomes rather than causes. Eventually, some communities move. Others remain and transform. Neither choice represents failure. Both are responses to prolonged pressure. What disappears is not humanity, but a particular configuration of life. From a distance, history compresses this process into endpoints. Cities are marked as abandoned. Cultures are labeled declined. But within those labels lie decades, sometimes centuries, of lived experience. Understanding slow collapse reframes missing chapters. It reminds us that history is not made only by dramatic events. It is shaped equally by long periods of adjustment that leave few records behind. Collapse, when it comes slowly, is not an ending. It is a reorganization. And reorganizations rarely leave monuments. Not every missing chapter is silent. Some are written, clearly, deliberately, yet remain unreadable. Across the world, archaeologists have uncovered scripts that resist translation. They are not damaged. They are not fragmentary. They simply do not yield meaning. These writings suggest organized societies. Standardized symbols imply shared understanding. Repetition indicates rules. Directionality shows intent. Yet without a known reference, a bilingual text, a familiar language family, a cultural key, meaning stays locked. The Indus Valley script is one of the most famous examples. Found on seals, pottery, and tools, it appears consistently across a vast region. Its symbols repeat in patterns that resemble language. But no long texts survive. No translations exist. The people who wrote it left no known descendants who carried the script forward. Other undeciphered systems exist as well. Linear A in the Aegean world. Rongorongo on Easter Island. Symbols carved into stone, wood, and clay, all deliberate, all persistent, all silent to us. Writing is often assumed to preserve memory. But it only does so if continuity survives. Scripts depend on teaching. When social systems collapse or transform, literacy can vanish within generations. A written language can disappear even as people remain. These scripts challenge how we think about historical loss. We imagine destruction as fire or conquest. But sometimes loss occurs through forgetting. A child is never taught to read what their parent once wrote. Meaning fades not because it was erased, but because it was no longer needed. Archaeologists can analyze form, frequency, and placement. They can say where writing appeared and how it was used. But without semantic access, the voices remain distant. The texts exist, but the stories are gone. This creates a unique kind of absence. Not an empty space, but a sealed one. Evidence without interpretation. Presence without understanding. These unreadable scripts remind us that history is not only what survives physically. It is what remains connected across time. When that connection breaks, even words become mute. Some chapters were not destroyed. They were simply never passed on. When written memory fades, stories take its place. Not as deliberate fiction, but as preservation by imagination. Myths often emerge where records fail, filling gaps left by lost language, broken continuity, and forgotten explanations. This is not deception. It is survival. When a society loses access to its past, it does not abandon meaning. It reshapes it. Events once understood in practical terms become symbolic. Leaders turn into gods. Natural disasters become moral lessons. History becomes narrative. Over generations, accuracy becomes less important than coherence. A story that explains why the world is the way it is matters more than one that records how it happened. Myths do not aim to preserve facts, they preserve identity. This process can be traced archaeologically. Monumental structures outlast their builders. Later populations encounter ruins without context. They ask the same question every human asks when faced with the unknown: who built this? The answer rarely begins with uncertainty. Instead, explanation grows. Giants, gods, lost civilizations, these ideas provide closure. They replace missing chapters with meaning. What is lost in accuracy is gained in continuity. Myths often contain fragments of truth. Environmental collapse becomes a flood story. Migration becomes exile. Political collapse becomes divine punishment. These narratives encode memory in forms that survive long after detail disappears. But myth also obscures. Once symbolic meaning dominates, practical knowledge is forgotten. The original function of structures fades. The actual cause of events dissolves into moral framing. What remains is emotionally true, but historically blurred. This transition marks a critical boundary. It separates lived history from remembered tradition. On one side are people who experienced events. On the other are those who inherited only stories. Missing chapters often sit precisely at this boundary. Where records end and myth begins. Where explanation shifts from evidence to imagination. Understanding this process changes how we read ancient stories. Myths are not lies. They are responses to loss, attempts to preserve connection when facts could no longer be carried forward. When memory fails, meaning adapts. An adaptation leaves stories where history once stood. History feels orderly when viewed from a distance. Dates line up. Periods are labeled. Transitions appear clean. But this order is often an illusion created long after events unfolded. In reality, timelines overlap, fragment, and contradict one another, leaving gaps that are difficult to reconcile. Many civilizations did not experience clear endings or beginnings. Instead, different ways of life coexisted for generations. Old traditions persisted alongside new systems. Ancient practices survived quietly while official narratives shifted around them. This creates confusion in the archaeological record. A site may contain layers that seem out of sequence. Technologies appear earlier than expected. Cultural traits resurface after assumed disappearance. From a modern perspective, this looks like error. From a human perspective, it reflects continuity. Written history often simplifies transitions to create coherence. Dynasties rise and fall neatly on paper. Eras begin and end at convenient dates. But people do not reorganize their lives according to calendars. Change spreads unevenly, faster in some places, slower in others. This misalignment creates missing chapters. When later historians attempt to reconstruct the past, they impose structure where none existed. Gaps are smoothed over. Contradictions are resolved by omission rather than explanation. Archaeology resists this simplification. Material evidence does not conform to narrative expectations. It preserves overlap, reuse, and adaptation. A tool used for centuries may appear in layers separated by time. A ritual may continue long after its supposed cultural context ended. These mismatched timelines challenge certainty. They remind us that history is not a single thread, but many strands moving at different speeds. What ends in one region continues elsewhere. What disappears officially survives privately. Missing chapters often emerge where timelines collide. Where one story ends and another has not yet been written. Where evidence refuses to align with narrative. Understanding this requires patience. It demands acceptance of uncertainty. The past does not always explain itself neatly. When timelines do not align, it is not because history is broken. It is because human experience does not move in straight lines. Not every missing chapter disappeared by accident. Some were intentionally concealed, restricted, or erased, not because they lacked value, but because they held power. Throughout history, knowledge has often been controlled as carefully as territory or resources. In many ancient societies, literacy itself was limited. Writing systems were complex by design. Training was restricted to elites, priests, or administrators. Knowledge was not meant to circulate freely. It was meant to stabilize authority. When power structures shifted, this knowledge became vulnerable. Libraries were abandoned. Archives were destroyed. Records tied to previous regimes were neglected or deliberately removed. What survived was often what aligned with new authority. Religious transitions played a major role. As belief systems changed, older texts were reinterpreted, suppressed, or labeled heretical. Not because they were false, but because they conflicted with emerging narratives. Entire bodies of thought were lost not to time, but to selection. This process did not always involve violence. Sometimes it was administrative. A text was no longer copied. A language was no longer taught. A tradition was excluded from formal education. Within generations, access vanished. What remains today is uneven. We possess fragments of advanced mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, but often without context. Manuals without explanation. Diagrams without commentary. Results without method. The loss feels intentional because it often was. Knowledge threatens hierarchy when it spreads beyond control. Limiting access preserves structure. Missing chapters emerge where suppression intersected with transition. When one system replaced another, continuity broke. What was once essential became obsolete overnight. Understanding this forces a shift in perspective. Absence does not always imply ignorance. Sometimes it indicates deliberate silence. The past was not always eager to be remembered. And what was hidden was often hidden for a reason. One of the most unsettling realities of human history is not what we have found, but who we never found at all. Entire populations lived, moved, and disappeared without leaving clear traces behind. No cities. No monuments. No written memory. Just silence. This absence does not imply insignificance. Many societies organized their lives in ways that did not prioritize permanence. They built with materials meant to return to the land. They moved with seasons. They adapted rather than settled. Their success was measured by survival, not endurance. For archaeology, these cultures are almost invisible. Stone preserves. Wood decays. Earth absorbs. What survives favors those who built to last, not those who lived lightly. Hunter-gatherer societies, early pastoralists, and nomadic groups shaped landscapes for thousands of years. They managed ecosystems, influenced animal migration, and transmitted knowledge orally across generations. Yet their footprints fade quickly. When environments changed or pressures increased, these groups moved on. They did not abandon cities because they never built them. They left no ruins because nothing was meant to remain. This creates a distorted historical picture. The past appears dominated by monument builders, kings, empires, architects of stone. But these were exceptions, not the rule. Most humans lived outside cities, outside writing, outside permanence. The missing chapter here is not a collapse. It is a way of life we are poorly equipped to detect. Occasionally, fragments surface. A campsite buried by sediment. A tool lost in transit. A burial preserved by chance. These finds hint at vast populations that once existed beyond historical focus. Their stories are difficult to reconstruct because they were never centralized. There was no single narrative. No archive. Just movement, adaptation, and continuity without record. History remembers what stays still. It forgets what moves. And some of the longest-lived human traditions were never meant to be remembered, only lived. Some of the most confusing gaps in human history are not found in ruins or myths, but on maps. Certain ancient maps depict coastlines, islands, and land masses with a level of accuracy that appears impossible for their time. They show details that should have required advanced navigation, precise measurement, or long-term geographic knowledge. Yet they were drawn centuries before such tools officially existed. The most famous examples are not fantasy maps. They are practical documents. They were used, copied, trusted, and in some cases, proven correct long after their creation. What makes these maps unsettling is not that they are inaccurate, but that they are selectively accurate. Some regions are distorted, while others align almost perfectly with modern geography. This suggests not guesswork, but inherited information. Maps are not created in isolation. They are compilations. They gather older sources, traveler reports, maritime knowledge, and remembered routes. When a map appears advanced, it may reflect generations of accumulated experience, much of which was never written down elsewhere. But this raises a critical question. Who gathered this information, and how? To map distant coastlines requires repeated travel. To chart currents and distances requires observation over time. To record latitude demands astronomical understanding. These skills imply organized exploration long before official records describe it. And yet, the explorers themselves are missing. No fleets are recorded. No expeditions described. No detailed logs survive. The maps remain, but the people behind them do not. This creates a gap between capability and documentation. Knowledge appears without context. Results without process. Later historians often explain this away as coincidence or exaggeration. But modern analysis has confirmed that some of these maps contain genuine geographic insight. The missing chapter is not technological mystery. It is human continuity. Knowledge moved quietly. Passed hand to hand. Sailor to sailor. Cartographer to cartographer. When systems changed, the maps survived, stripped of their origins. Sometimes history preserves the answer, but loses the story of how it was learned. One of the clearest examples of a missing chapter in human history is not a city or a monument, but a language. When a language disappears, it takes with it an entire way of thinking. Concepts, metaphors, categories of meaning, all gone, even if the people themselves survive. Sumerian is one of the earliest written languages known to humanity. It was spoken in Mesopotamia more than 5,000 years ago. For centuries, it was the language of administration, religion, law, and literature. Entire civilizations functioned through it. And then, it stopped being spoken. Sumerian did not vanish overnight. It was gradually replaced by Akkadian, a Semitic language that spread through conquest and trade. People adapted. They learned the new language. Daily life continued. But Sumerian slowly became something else, no longer spoken, only written. For hundreds of years, Sumerian survived as a scholarly language. Priests and scribes studied it much like Latin was studied in medieval Europe. Texts were copied. Grammar was taught. But this survival depended on institutions. When those institutions collapsed, the chain broke. Eventually, no one could speak Sumerian anymore. What remains today are clay tablets, tens of thousands of them, covered in cuneiform script. We can read many of the words. We understand the grammar. But we do not fully understand how the language felt to those who spoke it. Certain expressions have no equivalent. Certain concepts appear frequently but resist translation. Humor, rhythm, emotional tone, these are almost entirely lost. This is a missing chapter that cannot be recovered. Even with writing, even with translation, something essential disappeared when the last speaker died. Sumerian reminds us that writing does not guarantee survival. A language lives only as long as it is used. Once it becomes academic, it is already fading. And when a language disappears, history does not just lose words. It loses perspectives. Entire civilizations can still be visible in stone and clay, while their inner voice is gone forever. Before Rome became an empire, before Latin spread across Europe, another civilization dominated much of the Italian peninsula, the Etruscans. They built cities, developed complex religious systems, influenced architecture, engineering, and political organization, and yet, their language remains only partially understood. Etruscan was spoken for centuries in central Italy. It was used in daily life, rituals, funerary practices, and public inscriptions. The people who spoke it did not disappear suddenly. They were absorbed, gradually, into the expanding Roman world. And this is precisely why the language vanished. As Latin became dominant, Etruscan lost practical value. New generations adopted the language of administration, trade, and power. Etruscan survived for a time in religious contexts and family traditions, but without institutional support, transmission weakened. Today, thousands of Etruscan inscriptions survive. Tomb walls, sarcophagi, mirrors, pottery, all marked with text. We can read the alphabet. We recognize names. We understand basic grammar. But meaning beyond surface level often escapes us. There is no Etruscan literature preserved. No long historical texts. No philosophical writings. What remains are fragments, labels, dedications, short statements. Enough to prove the language existed, but not enough to reveal how it was fully used. This creates a strange imbalance. The Romans described Etruscan rituals in detail. Roman engineers borrowed Etruscan techniques. Roman symbols of power, even the toga, trace back to Etruscan origin. Yet the inner voice of the culture that shaped Rome is silent. Etruscan challenges a common assumption, that conquest erases the conquered. In reality, absorption can be more destructive to language than violence. When people survive but adopt a new identity, language fades quietly. The Etruscans were not destroyed. They were integrated. And integration left behind a civilization we can see, but not fully hear. This missing chapter reminds us that historical influence does not guarantee historical survival. A culture can shape the future, and still lose its own voice in the process. Among all lost languages, Linear A occupies a unique position. Unlike many undeciphered scripts, we know exactly where it comes from, when it was used, and which civilization relied on it. What we do not know is what it actually says. Linear A was used by the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete during the Bronze Age. It appears on tablets, seals, vessels, and religious objects. It was clearly part of an organized administrative system, used for record-keeping, offerings, and institutional control. The Minoans were not an isolated society. They traded widely across the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. They built complex palaces. They managed resources at scale. A civilization capable of this required structured language. And yet, Linear A remains unread. The reason is not lack of material. Hundreds of inscriptions survive. The symbols are consistent. Their placement suggests grammar and syntax. The problem lies elsewhere. Linear A has no known descendant language. There is no bilingual text. No Rosetta Stone. No continuity. When the Mycenaeans rose to power, they adopted a modified script, Linear B, which we can read. Linear B records an early form of Greek. But Linear A does not match Greek, nor any known language family. This tells us something crucial. The Minoans were not Greek-speaking. Their language represents a cultural lineage that did not survive conquest. When Mycenaean control replaced Minoan systems, Linear A stopped being used. Administration shifted. Education changed. The knowledge required to read and write the script vanished within generations. What remains today are symbols without voice. We can count them. Classify them. Map their distribution. But meaning remains inaccessible. This creates a hard limit on what we can know about Minoan society. We see their art. Their architecture. Their trade. But their laws, beliefs, and internal organization remain largely invisible. Linear A represents a complete linguistic break. Not erosion. Not partial loss. Total silence. Some civilizations leave ruins. Others leave writing. The Minoans left both, but not the key to connect them. When we speak about missing chapters of human history, it is tempting to imagine dramatic secrets, lost technologies, hidden powers, forbidden truths. But what is truly missing is often far quieter. What is missing is continuity. History survives where connection survives. When knowledge passes smoothly from one generation to the next, stories remain readable. When that chain breaks, through migration, conquest, collapse, or neglect, history fragments. Not because it was erased, but because it was never carried forward. Languages disappear. Skills become irrelevant. Traditions adapt or dissolve. Over time, what remains is incomplete. We inherit outcomes without explanations, structures without voices, names without stories. This is why so much of history feels unfinished. Not because we lack evidence, but because evidence alone is not enough. Context matters. Transmission matters. Memory matters. The past was not designed to be understood by us. It was lived, adjusted, and forgotten according to the needs of its own time. What survives does so by chance, not intention. Missing chapters remind us of a simple truth: history is not a record of everything that happened. It is a record of what managed to stay connected. And much of what mattered most never needed permanence to be meaningful. Missing chapters are not failures of history. They are reminders of human limitation. They show us that civilizations are not machines designed for progress, but living systems shaped by environment, belief, and circumstance. They grow, adapt, and reorganize, often without leaving clear explanations behind. Understanding this changes how we view the present. It softens certainty. It encourages humility. It reminds us that what feels permanent today may one day appear fragmented or misunderstood. The people of the past did not know they were becoming history. They made decisions for survival, for family, for meaning. Their stories were complete to them, even if incomplete to us. What we inherit is not their world, but its outline. And that outline is enough to teach us something important: that knowledge must be cared for, shared, and renewed. Otherwise, it fades quietly, not with loss, but with silence. History is not a solved puzzle. It is an ongoing conversation with what remains. Some chapters of human history will never be recovered. Not because they are hidden, but because they were never meant to last. Spoken words fade. Temporary shelters dissolve. Journeys leave no trace. Lives are lived fully without monument or record. And that is not a tragedy. It is a reminder that history is selective by nature. It preserves stone more easily than thought. Structure more easily than feeling. What disappears does not lose its value, it simply escapes documentation. As we look back, it is tempting to want completeness. To wish for perfect records, clear timelines, final answers. But the past does not owe us clarity. What it offers instead is perspective. The missing chapters teach us to accept uncertainty. To recognize that absence is not emptiness. To understand that not everything meaningful survives. And as we rest with these stories, both told and untold, we are reminded that history is not only about what came before us. It is also about what we choose to carry forward.